All right. Good morning, everyone. From Brisbane, my name is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students, and I'm talking this morning here in Brisbane with Cynthia Enloe from Clark University. I'm very happy to have you here.
Oh, I'm not only happy to be here, but to be in touch with all of you as well.
Yeah. Our topic today is Patriarchy is bigger than Donald Trump. How did you come to this topic?
Well, I think one of the things that worries me is that Donald Trump himself is, practically a cartoon figure. Like the big blimp that the British created to fly over his visit to England last week. So he's such a big figure that it can fool us into imagining that patriarchy really didn't exist before Donald Trump came along. But of course, patriarchy has continued to exist. This is just its newest form. It's most outrageous. Well, it's not the most outrageous, but it's a particularly outrageous form of patriarchy. So I really, particularly here at IAPSS, where it's such an international group of people who've come together, I just didn't want the kind of Trump focus to overwhelm everything else we know.
Mm-hmm. Before going more deeper into this topic that you're researching on right now, I'd be interested in your personal career. So before you were a professor, you were actually studying in Malaysia. And today many students are traveling, going to other countries, study abroad. Back then, when you had this international experience during your studies, looking back, what were the main takeaways? How did it change you, and how did it influence the way you think as a scholar today?
I had, as an undergraduate, I'd spent a bit of time in Germany as an exchange student, a very short time in the UK, but really I'd never spent as long a time as I did in Malaysia, which was only a year, so, and I was mainly in Kuala Lumpur, but I had anthropology students, friends, and so I went and studied, I went and visited them as well. I think it had, the reason I went to Malaysia was because I was very interested in ethnic politics. That's where I started. I started as an ethnic politics, comparative politics person. And I chose Malaysia because and it still is, the ethnic politics are so intense. And that's why I had studied it when I was at Berkeley and decided I'd make my research for my dissertation in Malaysia. It had an enormous effect on me. I think one of the things that really left me with, which it's never disappeared in my own thinking, is you have to know everything about a country in order to make any sense of its politics. It's just not enough to study politics to understand politics. And so when I was there, I was reading Malaysian novelists and short story writers. I was trying to understand the history of each of the ethnic groups, which meant I had to make sense of the rubber industry's history, the tin industry's history, the history of the sultans. And that really has stood me in good stead, is never to imagine that studying politics can be done effectively by only paying attention to the narrow definition of politics.
Mm-hmm. Have you been learning the local languages back then, or did you read in English?
Well, I was mainly working in English because at the time, the civil servants in Malaysia and most of the organizational leaders, they didn't use the word NGO then, but the organizational advocacy groups, for instance, the Chinese Teachers Association, they all worked in English. But I'm not really very facile in English, but I did manage to pass my Malay exam at Berkeley. And I again, it's one of these things, even when you're not good at something, it's really a good thing to try to have some facility in it just so you realize how hard it is. Mm-hmm. Right? So my studies in Malaysia, I occasionally had translators, but they were mainly with civil servants and people who are operating at the national level. Not always, but so that means I was working primarily in English without translators.
Mm-hmm. after this time, you started researching a lot on feminist theories. How did you get this interest, and how did it come to you that you want to research more on this topic?
Well, actually, Tobias, I was slow. I also did work in Guyana in the Caribbean without any feminist curiosity. So don't make me sound smarter than I am. I really did take time. I mean, it's been a good thing to have so many years of grounding in ethnic politics. I mean, I think that's real, which means I never think about women's experiences in any country without wondering whether women in different ethnic communities have different experiences of politics. So I've carried along my interest in ethnic politics wherever I go. But I began being interested, I think, and I didn't call it gender. I really started out being interested in feminism because I began having feminist friends, you know? And I think it's really important when you're in grad school especially that you have a lot of friends who aren't grad students, so that you remember there's life and politics and culture out there, and out there means out of the grad seminar. And that really was important for me. So I began to have a lot of friends who were certainly more feminist than I was. I was never anti-feminist. I didn't even realize what I was missing. But those friends began to say, well, you should read this and you should read that. And how come you don't know Adrienne Rich's poetry or Kathleen Barry's work on prostitution internationally? How come? I'd be, slightly embarrassed. And then they'd give me, it's always good to have friends who give you books to read that you didn't even know existed. So I became a feminist really because of outside friends, in particularly the US and the UK, who really embarrassed me into learning more about feminism and about women's movements.
Mm-hmm. So I find this particularly interesting because feminism always has these several components. There's the scientific component, there's an activist component. How was it for you? Because you also spoke about the social environment at that time. How you connected or separated these two lives as an activist or as a political scientist?
I try not to separate them. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's for me, I think it's really deadly to kind of silo your curiosities, your knowledge, your understandings, your passions. Let them mingle, because each will feed the other. I mean, in most countries, and certainly in the US, but in Malaysia and the Philippines and the UK, all the other countries I've tried to understand, it's been the activists in the women's movements who have made the academics smarter, not the other way around. I don't mean that academics have nothing to contribute, and I certainly have tried to contribute, but it's really been the activists' knowledge, the activist theorizing that has affected the academic research.
Mm-hmm. You've just mentioned a curiosity. What exactly is a feminist curiosity?
Well, the reason I developed the idea, because I remember when I wasn't curious, right? I mean, I was curious about all kinds of things about ethnicity and history and political structures. I mean, I thought I was very curious. The most ambitious book I did before I started asking gender questions was about racism and ethnicity in militaries all around the world, right? But I never asked questions about where were the women or why was it I was studying just men. And it was feminists, and particularly undergraduate students, because I was beginning to teach at this point, who said, well, you've studied all about racism in all these militaries around the world, so where is sexism in these militaries? And I said, I don't know. I never asked. And it's good to be embarrassed, right? And so I began asking questions I had never asked before. And that was really so exciting. It's a very exciting thing, isn't it? Don't you think? When all of a sudden you start asking a question that you had never thought to ask before, and you find these things that affect everything you're learning. So I was embarrassed into asking new questions. So for me, a feminist curiosity is to ask questions not just about where are the women, but where are the men? How did each of them get to where they are in whatever process you're looking at? What do they think? This is part of the curiosity. What do the women, diverse, and the men, diverse, what do they think about being where they are? And what do they do about it? Do they think it's just natural for women to have the lowest wage jobs? Do they think, oh, well, that's the way I can split my time between taking care of the kids and having a paid job? Or do they rile against it? And so you have to ask, where are the women? Where are the men? Why are they where they are? Who put them there? Who makes profit off of them each being where they are? And what do the women and men in those positions, all kinds of positions, in garment factories and militaries and diplomatic corps, what do they think about being there?
What I'm interested in right now is you're explaining you didn't have this interest or this curiosity from the beginning, and I think that is an experience that many share with you. Why do you think it is this way that it appears that curiosity for certain issues as feminism is something that evolves over time and is not there from the beginning? Is it because it is not so visible? Because I would assume it is a very visible issue, isn't it?
Yes, I think sometimes, even as good as our mentors are, right, in graduate school and undergraduate, we sometimes just adopt their curiosities. And if they don't ask about how racism works, or they don't ask about disabilities, or they don't ask about the complex workings of gender, then you find that you don't ask. Now, the thing is, usually and I'm talking about good mentors, right? Good faculty supervisors. Usually they are making you ask so many other questions. Your head just feels full. It doesn't feel like, oh, I'm being lazy, I'm only asking, 50% of the questions. You feel as though your head is just bursting with new ideas, new questions, new understandings. And so sometimes you have to get away and have other people say, well, how come? And those other people may not be other faculty members. They may not be other graduate students. They may be your friends who are more involved in some campaign. And they say, well, you're a researcher. Have you found? You think, oh, I'm sorry, I've never asked about that. So I think curiosity keeps evolving.
Mm-hmm. So how can we, I know that's a very broad question, but how can we explain then, following your words, that curiosity leads to some sort of awareness also? How can we explain then that some patriarch, as Donald Trump, for example, gets elected as U.S. president? Have people been not curious enough, or?
Yes, I think a lot of electoral results, we were just talking about Hungary or Australia or Germany or the U.S. or India or Japan. I think a lot of electoral results that seem to bring into office people who are quite sexist are the result because of a lot of voters not asking. If they ask one question, they don't ask the follow-up question, and then they don't ask the follow-up question. And when certain journalists, really good journalists, with gender curiosities, do ask those questions, do those reports on the candidates in the middle of the campaign, we sometimes think, oh, that doesn't matter, or that won't matter. It matters now, and yes, it's terrible he told that joke, whoever it is, in the election, but it won't matter when he gets into office. And then it turns out it really does matter. So there are a lot of really good gender-smart journalists out there who are trying to cover, I'm just sticking to electoral campaigns, trying to cover the gender aspects of different candidates and different parties' proposals, and also their own history with women, if they're men, and we don't pay attention. We don't take it seriously.
Mm-hmm. So if you, when you look at patriarchy,
yes,
do you basically have a critique on the agency? So basically, we should not limit patriarchy to certain agents in the society, but rather look on structural fundaments or structural problems. What is the core of your argument here?
Well, first of all, I think that most of us have patriarchal ideas. So I never think that patriarchy is just the result of elites. It's the result of our receptivity to what they're arguing. So I'm very interested in complicity. In this newest book, I really tried to make it much more upfront, to look at my own complicity. Several of the chapters really look at all the things I never wondered about, and that's my complicity. I think structure and culture and individual agency are constantly in a dance. I'm not a post-structuralist in the sense of structure doesn't matter. Of course it matters what kind of electoral system you have. Of course it matters what kind of legal structures you have. I mean, if you have been sexually assaulted, is there a policing structure you trust? And that's structure. So structure, agency, and culture, that is ideas, assumptions, unspoken assumptions, they're all in a constant dance. And I think as a feminist, you're interested in all of them and the relationship between them. You can't choose one or the other. Mm-hmm. Well, you can, but it's not smart.
Yeah, but looking then back at activist movements, isn't it easier from a civil society perspective to focus on certain actors in the very beginning, so because these are far better to grasp for many people, so it's easier to concentrate on symbols of patriarchy rather than getting everyone on the streets while saying, oh, but you're complicit.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to do both. I think a social movement is always trying to change ordinary, that's all of us, ordinary people's perceptions of is a husband beating a wife, is that a normal part of marriage, right? Yes, you have to change legislators and judges' understandings of that, but you have to change all of our understandings. As a neighbor, do we just not listen to the screams next door? So we're complicit, but we have to also change elites, people with authority, people who can change structures. We have to pay attention to them as well and push them really hard. So I don't let ordinary people off the hook. That's all of us. I don't let myself off the hook. At the same time, as you're right, looking at and paying attention to people who seem to have either celebrity or authority, and those aren't the same things. But people who have celebrity or authority and watching them, that's Harvey Weinstein, for instance, that's very useful, but you never can stop there. Mm-hmm. Never.
So what are, because you already mentioned your new work, what are other solutions and pathways that you are looking into right now in your work?
Well, first of all, I'm really trying to learn from other feminist campaigns. I mean, I think there's so many feminist campaigns in so many countries now, whether it be in Serbia or it be in Ukraine, for instance. I was just in Ukraine, so I'm thinking about Ukrainian feminists a lot. But also in Turkey, the Turkish women's movement is so important. In Egypt, I realize I just don't know enough. And when they're translated into English, I really want to know what Turkish feminists think. Luckily, I have several Turkish feminist friends, and they constantly educate me, which is a good thing. So I'm always learning from other countries' feminist campaigns, because they have new ideas. They put together causalities in different ways that make me really kind of sit up and take notice. You never can stop learning, right? Yeah. You'd be dead.
I mean, that's interesting also from the perspective that political science is trying right now a lot to globalize the discipline and to find general global answers. For topics like feminism, isn't this much harder because you have to be so much more sensitive towards individual countries' situations, how hierarchies and these kind of things work out. So how does feminism in general react to these globalizing forces within the discipline?
Well, I think it's been very energizing. I mean, I think that the first, it's not the first time, that's not true at all, because the first International Women's Peace Congress was in 1915 in The Hague, and a scholar that many of you will know, Ann Tickner, is now looking again at the 1915 movement, and Jane Addams, who was really one of the first global feminist activists. But I think it's also true for political science. I think political science, and all of us as political scientists, we really have to be much more sensitive to local variations. And I'm very wary of global theories. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Global questions I like, because it doesn't mean that you'll find the same answer, but at least you're asking some common questions. I'm very wary, very cautious about global causal theories about how power works. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think actually feminists are ahead of the game. I think, yes, you have to be energetic. Yes, you have to be on your toes. Yes, you have to be curious. But of course, that makes you a better political scientist.
Mm-hmm. We have one question that was asked
Sure.
by Girmish, who asks us whether we study feminism under the human rights perspective, and then does feminism, I think we've discussed it in parts, but
Sure.
not totally, does feminism exclusively target women or also include men?
Let's start with the back and we'll come forward. Feminists are always curious about the workings of masculinities, plural, and the workings of femininities, and how the workings of femininities and masculinities distort power and rights. So, feminists have always been interested in men, and watching them and watching ideas, and including women's ideas about masculinities. What makes a good husband? What makes a good soldier? What does a woman who has a son want for her son? I mean, those are all workings of masculinities in the lives of women. But at the same time, feminism is always determined to keep an eye on inequality and injustice. I think that's what makes feminist analysis different than simply gender analysis. Gender analysis is a very useful thing to do. It asks about the workings of masculinities and femininities in development or in arms trade or in anything. You become a feminist analyst of gender, and then you ask about power, and especially the inequalities of power and the unjust workings of power. If you're just a gender analyst, you might not ask enough about power and about injustice. And that brings us to human rights. Most feminists have some commitments to human rights, but they don't stop at human rights because so much doesn't fall directly under human rights, especially questions of poverty, questions of violence, questions of suppression of all kinds of life's desires. So yes, human rights, yes, but that's not by itself enough.
All right. I see we don't have any more questions coming in right
good.
now, and I also asked my questions. I would really like to thank you for being here with us today.
That's great.
And wish you all the best. Thank you for having the time, and have a great day here.
Yes, and listen, to all of you out there, I know that we're going to be in the same conference halls at some time, or same university seminar rooms at the same time. So be sure and come up and say hi and tell me what you're up to.
Actually, right now we have 2 more questions coming in this moment. So maybe if you have the time, we also talk about those. So Nuno asks, what is your opinion about political correctness in the context of feminism?
Well, it's very funny about that term, political correctness in English. It was originally, back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a joke amongst feminists. We joked with each other about it. Then the right wing came along and claimed that feminists' insistence on anti-racism, feminists' insistence on respect, feminists' insistence, for instance, on using Ms., MS, period, so that you don't always designate a woman's marital status, right? The right wing came along, the anti-feminists, the patriarchs, came along and called that political correctness as if it were shallow and superficial and not meaningful, as if it were trivial. And so they began to take something that was originally a feminist joke amongst feminists, a kind of teasing, kind of nice teasing joke, and turned around into a weapon to try and diminish the seriousness with which feminist questions were being taken. So I never rise to the bait. I think that most things that are labeled political correctness are in fact just an effort to be polite, to treat people with respect, to treat people with dignity. And that is never trivial.
And another question coming in this century, does it even make sense to talk about feminism in the working class?
Gosh, oh yes. I mean, as long as there is the exploitation of women and the exploitation of men based on unrealistic ideas about what it means to be manly or what it means to be a real woman, so long as that exists in the workplace, there is absolutely not only the relevance of feminism, the need for feminist analysis and feminist campaigning. Oh, for sure.
All right. Thank you very much for also replying to these two questions. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and for raising your points today. Have a great day, and thank you very much again.
And thanks for your good questions and for listening at probably the middle of the night.